So welcome everyone to our webinar today, Pharma and the Patient Organization, hosted by the Coalition of Skin Diseases. I apologize, it's probably the 100th million webinar you've been on this year, but I promise that it's going to be amazing. Trisha and Alana are just wonderful people to work with. I met them several years ago in Milan, and we've had a relationship ever since, and have gotten to know a little bit more about the process and how patient organizations can get involved with industry to really have a win-win partnership there. So I'm just so excited today to have them share. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce them, and then I will let them take it away. So here we have Alana. Alana Tabak is the Director of Patient Advocacy at Regeneron. And in her role, she focuses on supporting those most impacted by dermatological, respiratory, and GI diseases, as well as allergies, by working with patient advocacy groups and professional organizations. Alana has been with Regeneron for 5 years, and prior to that worked with healthcare communications for clients in the pharmaceutical and nonprofit space. And then we have Trisha Devlin. Trisha leads Eli Lilly's global dermatology engagements and partnerships, which also includes advocacy. She has a role that works across Eli Lilly's portfolio of products and with clinical development, medical affairs, marketing, and corporate affairs to ensure that the company understands the community needs. She works with nonprofit patient groups, professional associations, patients, and caregivers to support education, awareness, and understanding of these diseases in the community. Prior to Eli Lilly, Trisha has worked at several small biotech companies and large pharma companies across multiple disease areas, with always a connection to the patient. So just wanted to give you a little housekeeping. If you have any questions, and we will have a time for question and answers at the end, go ahead and put them in the question and answer box, or you could put them in the chat as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Alana to take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting us to be on. Trisha and we've been in the same circle for a few years now, so we're super excited to have a chance to do this webinar together. So before we dive in, the areas that we really hope to cover today is just to give a high-level overview of the patient advocacy function within industry. Then I know, Kelly, you have some really great slides around the drug development process. And then Trisha and I want to come back and talk about patient perspectives in drug development and overview of how to seek support from industry partners. And then, as Kelly mentioned, hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So this is really going to be very conversational. So I'm going to kick off, and Trisha, maybe talk to us a bit about the role of patient advocacy in industry. How do you describe to someone what it is that you do at Lilly?
Yeah, I think Alana and I probably have one of the best jobs within the industry. We get to work with community partners on a day-to-day basis. And I describe the role as engaging with nonprofit organizations to really bring through their perspective of what the community needs, and also partner that with what the pharma companies need or their desires, or even to better understand the community itself. I have, as Alana says, with similar roles, but each company has a different approach to patient advocacy. Sometimes we don't always call it patient advocacy. Sometimes my title is engagement and partnerships, but it's still, at the end of the day, is connecting with the community to better understand the needs and also opportunities where we can partner to raise education and awareness.
That's great.
Alana, how does is your role the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of similarities, as you mentioned. And really, our job is to not only just know what our companies are focused on and where our clinical and business priorities are, but to get to know organizations and understand their areas of focus and strategic priorities, and find that common ground where we can really work together. I think, I like to think of our job as serial daters. We like to date organizations, and we like to get into serious relationships with them. I don't think either of us approach this as transactional type of relationships, but how do we get to know each other? Our companies have strengths and weaknesses, and the same goes for organizations. And so really learning about each other through our coffee dates and our regular meetings but ultimately coming together to figure out what is it that patients and caregivers need, and how can we help support getting that need addressed for them.
Yeah, great perspective. I have the same here at Eli Lilly. Let me ask you another question. I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. Alana, how do you, within your company, engage with advocacy groups specifically? And then how is that might be different from professional societies?
Yeah, no, I think what's interesting is that like you had mentioned, Trisha, our functions can have different names depending on what company you work for. And to me, patient advocacy, oftentimes I get a little bit of a interesting look when people find out that we also work with professional societies. But the way I try to explain it is that professional societies also have a lot of patient-facing channels and resources that they are also putting out into the universe. And so it's important for us to understand what those are and make sure that we're helping to support those efforts as well. And it's really about meeting people wherever it is that they're looking for information. I would say from an overall perspective, we like to meet with organizations regularly. Just because we've met at the beginning of the year to talk about that year's priorities, that doesn't mean that those don't shift and change over time. And so having touch points throughout the year is really important and really helpful for us to know if there's something that's really changing based on community need. Do you take a similar approach, Trisha?
I do. And I think one thing I can also add is I've been at small companies and acquired by bigger companies like my current company. Eli Lilly acquired my last company when I got to meet so many of you guys in the derm space. My previous company was Demira. And I hope that many people find that my approach is still the same, no matter if I was at a small company or at a larger company. Larger companies tend to have multiple products in the certain disease states. So sometimes we may have to balance in our roles of what priority is with this brand or a different initiative within something that's in the clinic, because we want to look at our whole portfolio in these diseases, not necessarily just one view of one department. But yes, I don't necessarily take a different approach, but like Alana, I look always to say, what are your strategic initiatives at the beginning of the year? What are your top 3 priorities? And see where we might be able to marry them together. I do that with professional groups as well as patients, and always have regular calls to make sure that we're helping to advance those current partnership initiatives together. I think one thing we can segue into is one of the areas that many people ask us is, well, where do you engage and what are the stages of development? And I might turn this over to Kelly. So for Kelly to share some of the slides that you've put together on the stages of development. And we can also talk at a later point as to where Alana and I connect as well with the community.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. So I made this slide just with a couple of facts that were pretty startling to me when I found them out. And you can see that the cost of developing a new drug has been estimated between $314 million to $2.8 billion, with an estimation of $985 million per new drug on the market. Now, on an average, it takes about 10 years for a new medicine to go all the way through the process. Overall, the probability that a drug entering clinical testing will eventually be approved is estimated to be less than 12%. So in 2013 alone, companies sponsored 6,199 trials with 1.1 million participants. And I just pulled this graphic from Pharma's biopharmaceutical research for you to see how many drugs actually start at the beginning of the process and then make it to market at the end. I just thought that was pretty fascinating. It's a lot of work that goes into the development of drugs. So the first stage is discovery. And the discovery process serves to identify an investigational drug by performing initial tests in the lab. This first stage takes approximately 3 to 6 years. During discovery, thousands of compounds may be potential candidates, as we saw, for development as a medical treatment. But after testing, only a small number of them actually make it through to further study. Even at this early stage, researchers are already thinking about the final product and how it will be administered to patients, for example, whether it's taken by pill, injected, or inhaled. So before testing a drug in people, researchers must find out whether it has the potential to cause any serious harm. The two types of preclinical research are in vitro and in vivo. In vitro tests are experiments conducted in the lab, and in vivo studies are those in living cell and tissue cultures and animal models. Usually these studies are not very large. However, they must be able to provide detailed information on dosing and toxicity levels. After starting with thousands of candidate compounds, researchers identify one or more lead compounds that will go on to be studied in clinical trials, ensuring that they're safe enough to be tested in people. So while preclinical research answers basic questions about a drug's safety, it is not a substitute for studies of ways the drug will interact with the human body. So clinical research refers to studies or trials that are done in people. Clinical trials follow a typical series from early small-scale phase 1 studies to late-stage, large-scale phase 3 studies. Here and throughout the process, the FDA review team will consist of a group of specialists from different scientific fields. And before any of these clinical trials can begin, companies must file an investigational new drug or an IND application with the FDA. This application includes the results of the preclinical work, the candidate's drug's molecular structure, details on how the investigational medicine is thought to work in the body, a listing of any potential side effects as indicated by the preclinical studies, and manufacturing information. So during phase 1 studies, the new drug is tested in people for the first time, usually in a group of healthy volunteers of 100 people or less. The main goal of phase 1 trial is to assess the safety of the medicine when used in humans. Studies are closely monitored and gather information about how a drug interacts with the human body. Researchers look at the pharmacokinetics of a drug, how it's absorbed, metabolized, and eliminated, and they also study the drug's pharmacodynamics to see if the drug causes any side effects. These trials are designed to help researchers determine what is safe dosing ranges and if the candidate medicine should move on to the next stage of development. So here we go to phase 2. And in phase 2 studies, researchers administered the drug to a group of patients with a disease or condition for which the drug is being developed. Typically, these trials involve a few hundred patients that provide researchers with additional safety data, but are not large enough to show whether the drug will be beneficial. Many phase 2 trial study patients receiving the drug are compared with patients receiving a different treatment, either an inactive substance called a placebo or a different drug that is usually considered the standard of care for that disease. Researchers also analyze optimal dose strength and schedules for using the drug and examine any possible short-term negative side effects and risk associated with it. Scientists use these data to refine research questions, develop research methods, and design new phase 3 research protocols. So researchers design phase 3 studies to generate statistically significant data about the safety, efficacy, and the overall benefit-risk relationship of the investigational medicine to a specific population. Sometimes known as pivotal studies, these trials usually involve 300 to 3,000 participants and take place over several years. Phase 3 studies provide most of the safety data. In previous trials, it is possible that less common side effects might have gone undetected. Because these studies are larger and longer in duration, the results are more likely to show long-term or rare side effects. Phase 3 also provides the basis for labeling instructions to help ensure proper use of the drug. If a drug developer has evidence from its early tests and preclinical and clinical research that a drug is safe and effective for its intended use, the company can file an application to market the drug called a new drug application, or NDA. The NDA tells the full story of a drug and includes everything about it from preclinical data to phase 3 trial data. The NDA's purpose is to demonstrate that a drug is safe and effective for its intended use in the population that it's studied. The FDA review team thoroughly examines all submitted data on the drug and makes a decision to approve or not to approve it. If the review team decides that the NDA is not complete, they can refuse to file it. If it is complete, the review team has 6 to 10 months to make a decision on whether to approve the drug and which time they will assess whether effectiveness has been demonstrated for proposed use, whether the drug is safe, and if the benefits outweigh the risk, and if manufacturing methods and the controls used to maintain the product quality are adequate. Often the NDA contains sufficient data for FDA to determine the safety and effectiveness of a drug. Sometimes, though, questions arise that require additional consideration. And in these cases, the FDA may organize a meeting of one of its advisory committees to get independent expert advice and to permit the public to make comments. These advisory committees include a patient representative that provides input from the patient perspective, which is really important for us to know. In cases where FDA determines that a drug has been shown to be safe and effective for its intended use, it is then necessary to work with the applicant to develop and refine prescribing information. This is referred to as labeling. Labeling accurately and objectively describes the basis for approval and how best to use the drug. Often, though, remaining issues need to be resolved before the drug can be approved for marketing. Sometimes FDA requires the developer to address questions based on existing data. In other cases, FDA requires additional studies. At this point, the developer can decide whether or not to continue further development. And if a developer disagrees with an FDA decision, there are mechanisms for a formal appeal. So lastly, along the process is post-market surveillance. And even though clinical trials provide important information on drugs' efficacy and safety, it's impossible to have complete information about the safety of a drug at the time of approval. Despite rigorous steps in the process of drug development, limitations still exist. Therefore, the true picture of a product's safety actually involves over the months and even years that make up a product's lifetime in the marketplace. FDA reviews reports of problems with prescription and over-the-counter drugs through their FAERS database and by longitudinal studies. Based on these reports, they can then decide to add cautions to the dosage or usage information, as well as other measures for more serious issues. Both patients and healthcare providers can submit reports through MedWatch, as you can see on the right of the screen here, and can keep up to date on longitudinal studies that are posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So now I am going to hand it back over to Trish to continue the conversation now that we've had a little bit of background.
Thanks, Kelly. Very nice overview of all the different steps in development. As you can see that there's a lot, and it does take us a number of years to develop a therapy to come to the market. And there's what we call a lot of shots on goal, because a lot of times we might need multiple assets or multiple different products that fail in one setting or might be advanced in another setting, depending on dosing, depending on the way the trial was set up. But as you can see, that it does take a long time for a product to come from what we call bench to bedside to access to patients' care. Turning the tables a little bit, and I want to ask Alana what her thoughts are, but what has been the role of patient and caregivers in your company and those perspectives throughout the drug development process? How do you guys incorporate those aspects throughout development at Regeneron?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And you've worked with one company, So it always looks different. But I think, Regeneron really seeks to get input along the entire drug development continuum. And I can't emphasize enough to all of you who are on the webinar today that your voices are incredibly important for our companies to hear from. And sometimes it's the patients, and depending on the disease state and the patient population that we are studying, it could also be the caregivers for the people living with those diseases. And when I say along that entire drug development continuum, I think as we are working to develop protocols for our studies, it's really important for us to understand what is and isn't going to work for patients, what is really important for us to be measuring. I work often with our health outcome and economic reporting team in early stage clinical areas. So as Kelly sort of outlined, more in that phase 1, phase 2 space, to understand from a particular community, what are the outcomes that are really important to them from a potentially new treatment? Because we have to be measuring that and demonstrate efficacy in those outcomes, as well as what we may be talking to the FDA about. And I think the FDA has done a great job of helping to emphasize to companies like ours the importance and their expectation of us having patient insight and perspective along the way through their patient-focused drug development meetings and efforts around that. So those are just some of the ways at Regeneron I know that we seek to do that. But I imagine that there's probably some additional things that Lily takes into consideration. So What else do you think, Tricia, is good for advocacy organizations to really know about our process and where their voices are really important?
Yeah. Well, there's so much to unpack there with this question. And so I don't want to make it a runoff sentence, but please jump in there along the way, Alana, because I know we partner together well. There's a lot of areas. Lilly does, just like a lot of large pharma companies, engage patients at all stages of development, or we strive to. Sometimes we might do it through market research, but the goal is ultimately to do that as well through advocacy groups, as well as patients living with the disease, as well as caregivers. Sometimes we might ask 5 patients, sometimes we might ask 50 patients. It really depends on how we might need or better understand the diversity and perspective of the community. And I can't say that there's always opportunities. And I'll give you an example. In my previous company, we used to ask patients about packaging. We asked them about what is you want the colors to be. That might be very naive of a new brand or a product, but if you understand that there's already something that they're using that might be a red tube of something, and they hate the red tube of some medicine because it just makes them feel sick, well, then we don't want to create a red tube of the next product coming to the market. So I would just want to say that there's areas that we can always engage, not only from thinking of packaging or colors, but we as an industry strive to really ask patients along the way, what are their needs if they're living with this condition? What are the things that they would or would not do as part of a clinical trial? What are the needs from going to the pharmacy and picking up a drug if, when it comes to the market, and some of the challenges we might have too. And to put a different flavor on it too, Alana and I are at large companies. We also have the international perspective because our roles, we work with companies are in different countries. So a product that might be available here in the US might be 2 years before it becomes available in Mexico. And so many times we might be working with a patient group in Mexico when all of us in the US are like, we've done that. We already know those. But the perspective could be very different in different countries. And that's why our role is so unique, but also one of the best jobs in the industry, because we get to talk to the whole community and have different perspectives that we bring back to our partners internally. I hope I answered a number of those, but maybe it struck as something that you forgot, Alana, or was there something else you want to add?
Actually, it brings up another question for you, but not to make you keep talking, but I guess I'm curious, is there something that you did on behalf of either, at any point during that drug development that was like a real aha moment for you from that engagement? And what was that?
Yeah, I can give a couple examples, but I don't want to bore you guys with too many. And I also want to be mindful of our time. One thing I did at my small company is I encouraged my colleagues to think and talk to the patient community for a product that we were considering for a skin disease. And a lot of times my research team was like, no, we've heard from the physicians of what they need and what they want. And we developed this really sophisticated new cream for a skin disease. And I really pushed my research colleagues to say, let's go talk to patients. We talked to 10 patients in a setting, and come to find out they hated the product. It wasn't effective. It wasn't to see if it was effective for that skin disease. It was really to talk about the formulation. And they hated it because they felt as though that formulation absorbed into their skin too quickly, and they wouldn't remember if they put it on their skin underneath their makeup, under their sunscreen, or whatever it was. And so that was like an aha moment that my research team was like, oh, we better talk to patients more often. And those are some of the things that we positively changed with the community. We shared that back with a number of the physicians in that disease state. And we also shared it with the organization to say, wow, we thought that this new advanced lightest formula would be the greatest thing ever. But the same thing is that if you don't talk to the community, you might not actually ever meet the needs of what you're looking for. Yeah. So that's an example, I'd say, that a really good one, and the product is still progressing in development. Hopefully one day it would come to the market for patients. And but that's an area where I was encouraged to talk to patients, talk to the advocacy group to better understand what their need was and how we positively changed the trajectory of this new medication potentially to the market.
That's so great. What a great example of just how powerful and how important it is to have those perspectives. And, you know, it's one of the things I love about our jobs is it's just as important for us to bring those insights internally to our colleagues,
Yeah.
to have those conversations. And it's not always about what do our colleagues are looking to achieve and what do we need from a partnership. So that's great.
Yeah, I might also highlight one other one, if it's all right, Alana, and I'm sure you have a couple you might want to say, but I think some of the times that these ideas spur more ideas for us in the industry to create new opportunities. It's not always a recipe book to say we could do X, Y, and Z in these stages. Sometimes talking to the community and understanding their needs, or maybe they don't always know their needs. A good example, I see Lisa Peretti from the IHHS on the call. At Demira, Lisa and I worked very closely to better understand how hyperhidrosis, a skin condition, impacted pediatric children and how people who didn't even have the disease talked about it. And so working with the community and developing a better understanding of the unmet need spurred a number of educational programs that we both jointly worked on. And it was very, very rewarding to learn more about the community. I think Lisa would probably say the same thing, that started with what we thought was a simple question, led to like a 2.5 to 3 year project with a lot of different legs for us to better understand between our two teams. So Alana, I'm sure you probably have one that you'd like to share from yours.
Sure. Yeah. So mine actually, I'll share one that is not in the derm space, but was in the food allergy space. And we did a bit of a digital listening tour, if you will, to really understand, and because we were studying this in the pediatric and adolescent age group, and so it was conversations with caregivers and where appropriate, if the child was an appropriate age, with the child as well. And it was incredibly eye-opening to our clinical team about the decision making that these two people make in deciding whether or not to enroll in a clinical trial. And talk about having some very different perspectives brought to the table, right? How a parent thinks versus how their child thinks about something is very, very different. But I think the other really big insight that we learned, because this was in the food allergy space, was that approaches and thinking about whether to get into a clinical trial also really depended on whether that child had ever experienced an anaphylactic situation. And if they had been faced with that, the chances of them wanting to be in a clinical trial was much less, as you can imagine. There was a lot of anxiety and stress because they'd had that experience. The same for the parent or the caregiver. Whereas if it wasn't something that they had necessarily experienced themselves, they seemed to be a little bit more open. And all of this was really important insights for our clinical team to take into perspective to bring to the clinical trial sites who do the actual recruiting for the trials, so that those conversations could happen up front and those topics could be addressed up front in order to really help with the decision-making process. It was very, very eye-opening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And really, yeah, super important for us to hear about it. So I want to make sure we have time to get to our last topic before Q&A, because this is probably an area that a lot of folks on the webinar are interested in. And part of the partnership between advocacy groups and industry means sponsorship and grant support. So just curious, Tricia, if you can do an overview of what the request, what the process to request support looks like, either at Lilly or a bit more broadly across industry.
Yeah, for sure. And so Eli Lilly has 2 avenues. We have a grant portal, the Lilly Grants Office, that's on our corporate website. That is one way. In addition to that, that is what we call a totally different team. They look at the process and the grants independently of any input sometimes from the organization. That is a good channel to submit requests, but they only do grants. And sometimes they even don't even share what they've approved and denied with the team members that they've engaged with the community. So that's okay, but that we want to ensure that they're as independent as possible. And so that's why they don't always share that input. But however, I would say from a request perspective, I think if you send proposals into people like myself, or if Alana at Regeneron has a different process, you can send them to like myself at Eli Lilly. Smaller companies usually have one individual you send them to. And what I would include is always the purpose of the program or the event that you're looking to host. What are your objectives that you're trying to achieve? Also, the dollar amount is always very nice to put in the request form. In addition, how the money will be used over a period of time. Because sometimes we get requests and it says we would like X amount of money. And we're like, okay, well, is that over 5 years, 5 months? Is that in the US? Is that internationally? What is that hopefully going to be used for? And so I would recommend utilizing as much information as you can in your letter of request. Always connect with someone like Alana or myself, what additional requirements each company has. And one thing I've also used as a rule of thumb as nonprofits, don't over-engineer it. Because sometimes if you write this very extensive letter to me, and then you write a very extensive similar letter and send it to the other pharma companies, you don't have to always do that. Many of us in the industry have very similar or almost identical requirements. It's usually always the budget amount, the time period, what's it going to be used for, and the objectives. We might have a couple other aspects, but those are usually the core things that we all ask and we need to review as part of our role. I'm assuming by you shaking your head, you have the same, Alana?
Yeah, we do. And you know, in the dermatology space, we like to keep it interesting for our organization. So I know that we've got IPPF on, and I see some folks from Global Skin. So they know that across a lot of the disease areas that we work in dermatology, we are in a collaboration with Sanofi Genzyme. So now you're not just dealing with one company, but two companies. And so you're dating multiple people. But I will say that I think you know, we have a great collaboration between our two companies, and we do make sure to come with a single perspective and approach. But it's very similar where there is a portal to submit your request through. And yes, we look for a lot of the same information that you listed, Trisha. I think what I would add is I would remind people that while you're having conversations and getting to know folks like Trisha and myself, and we get to know you as organizations and as leaders of your groups, these requests have to get reviewed and signed off on by our compliance colleagues. They don't know you. And they don't know, you know, what your organization is about. So when you hear Trisha talking about a really well-formed letter of request, I think it's really important to remember that we've been having the conversations with you all, but eventually someone is going to have to read your request who may not be familiar with you as an organization, the issue or the unmet need that you're really looking to tackle. So writing your request from that perspective and with that mindset, I think is really important. And it helps to head off a lot of the follow-up questions that we might get from our reviewers, you know, because the information will already be included in that request. And then I think I would just add, and Trisha, I'm sure Lily is like this as well, you know, we ask for those timelines and those estimated budgets because we need to have some sort of sense, but we certainly understand that things happen. No one was anticipating COVID. And so it's okay if a program or an initiative may take longer to get off the ground or be delayed. But what is your best guess with all pandemics and other what might come out of the left side put aside? What's your best guess for how long you think it would take your organization to complete something? I'm curious, Trisha, how do you go about conversations with groups around programs that you've provided support for, as far as really understanding how they're developing and, frankly, how organizations may measure success or what success looks like?
That's a good question. I think that I always usually ask the organization what their success factor is. It's not our success factor because we're supporting you, and hopefully most of the request is multi-sponsored. That's another thing we did talk about, is that
Good point.
compliance people and our roles, we always love when things are multi-sponsored, and the reason being is that it doesn't look like it's to the benefit of one brand or one company. It reduces the risk within an organization if it's multiple sponsored. And so I'm sorry, I forgot your question. I think maybe I
It
haven't
was
had that
around
caffeine.
metrics and
Yes,
success. Yes.
metrics. But I would say that, we always look at what the organization feels is success. Sometimes timelines get away from all of us. And just to having a gut check along the way, with those relationships, if I went out to one of the organizations saying, can you tell me what's going on with this video that we help support with other groups? They might say, you know what? COVID just got away from us and we think it's going to be done by December now. Okay, no problem. Thank you. We'll just note that in the records. But it's not something that has to be put in writing all the time, but just to better understand life happens and sometimes people change at organizations. We can't deliver on everything that you anticipated.
Well, I think it's also so helpful for us to know if timelines shift, because I'm sure you do this too, Trisha, but when there is a new resource or new asset, we want to make sure that our internal colleagues know about it as
Yeah.
well. And we can't tell them about it if, we don't know that maybe it's gotten delayed or that it's already launched. I think you have to remember that Trisha and I oversee quite a few different disease areas and work both US and ex-US. And I would love to say that the bulk of my day I get to spend on organizations' websites and looking at content and information, but that's not always possible. And so I think I really appreciate an organization that takes that step. I think it takes the relationship beyond that transactional um, point, and to say, it's not just about the fact that you provided us support to be able to do this, but we want you to see, here is the outcome, and we're so thrilled and excited that it's launched, or here is how it's doing, or to your point, Trisha, here are some of the challenges we're running into.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other part we didn't talk about is sometimes something might be really of interest to us in the industry to support and sponsor, but by the time we get through the funding request and the proposal, it might not be the same look and feel as when it was presented to us. And so sometimes we in the industry might have to deny something. It's not that it's a bad idea, it's just that it could have changed from day 1 to day 70. And that's okay. It just means that maybe we reallocated our resources and want to partner up on a different thing, double or less something else. But always be mindful of, something can change. That's okay. Just be transparent. We will be as transparent as we can as well,
Yeah.
along the way. Well, I know we've had a lot of questions or a lot of back and forth and great dialogue, and I see Kelly popping in probably to tell us it's time for the Q&A.
Yes, we've had some great questions come in, and we will answer as long as we can up until 3 o'clock or the hour. So Mark has a question for you. How can patient organizations work more effectively with industry to develop meaningful patient clinical trial outcomes?
Good question. Trisha, I don't know if you want to go first or if you want me to.
Why don't you go first and then I can compliment.
Sure. Mark, I think that's a great question. And I know you and have had some conversations around this as well. I think that there's a couple of different ways, but as leaders of organizations that are representing a particular community, I think you guys are in a really unique position to bring insights to us. And so I think you heard Trisha say, there's a lot happening in the pipeline at both of our companies. There's a lot of shifting priorities. But I think organizations should not be shy around taking insights from their community and proactively asking for time to share those insights, especially when they pertain to your point, Mark, to clinical trial outcomes. Um, I know that IPPF recently held a listening session with the FDA, and the report you guys put out was terrific. So I think as an organization, it's how do you take that report and now reach out to each of your industry partners and say, we'd love to walk you through some of the key findings and what we shared with the FDA, but not just you, Alana. What other colleagues do you think would be good to have at the table? Medical affairs, clinical, HEOR, maybe even marketing. And so, I really encourage organizations to think through the power and the resources and the insights that you have to bring to that conversation. Trisha, I don't know what your thoughts are. If you want to add.
Yeah, I would also add sometimes we as an industry, we've reached out to patients and we didn't reach out to the advocacy group or vice versa. And so I think that there's aspects that we'll always try to incorporate. And it's also on the role of the industry or the partner to say, those are fantastic inputs that won't be effective in this clinical trial, but here's the challenges why. Like a good example is the FDA won't let us do a trial with just the new therapy all by itself in a new disease area. We have to have something to make sure patients continue on and don't get worse under the standard of care. So that's on us to do a good job or a better job to say, we appreciate these inputs. We want to do them, but I think we as a partnership with you guys need to say, these are what we can and can't do with the regulators.
Great, thank you. So our next question comes from Janice, and she says, asks, how does a rare disease organization that is not involved already with one of these companies begin to engage with them? Or maybe a better question is, how does a rare disease organization create interest, see if there's any priorities that align with a pharmaceutical company and connect in the first place?
Can we take that one, Lana, first?
Sure.
Okay.
I think, part of what Trisha and I do when we are starting to go into a new disease area or just getting to know a community is we do our homework. We look at what organizations are out there that exist or maybe don't exist to support a patient community. We spend time on their websites to understand what their mission and vision are. What are they focused on? Are they solely fundraising? Do they focus on advocacy and patient education? And I think it's just as important for groups to do their homework on the companies that they want to start relationships with. And probably like every industry partner out there, Lilly and Regeneron, we have a lot of information on our corporate websites around our pipeline. And so we disclose when it's appropriate what we're studying in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And so I think one simple thing to do is make sure that you're going to the websites and that you're going more specifically maybe to the investor relations area or the pipeline and new science area to see what we are studying, to see maybe there's already a potential interest or overlap. And if there isn't, I think it goes back to how do I make sure that they know that there is a huge need for my particular disease and patient community. And I think Trisha and I are the kind of people to look for in organizations to reach out to. I know a lot of times it's like, who do I even reach out to, right? You're not going to pick up the phone or try to send an email to the CEO, but maybe somebody in patient advocacy could be a really good initial contact. But I think it's good to know which industry there are companies that really focus on rare diseases. There's companies that focus just on rare respiratory or rare derm, and then there's companies that kind of do it all. And so you really have to sort of get to know our pipeline and where our business strategic areas lie.
Yeah, I might also complement it to Alana's great points. If you don't know somebody at another company and it's a big company, let's just say, and you're like, wow, where do I start? The only person I see on the website is the CEO. That might not get to him or her. I would encourage you to reach out to your CSD colleagues to say, do you have anyone that works at that company, to say, do you know who that patient advocacy person is that I might be able to leverage and reach out to them that way? Reach out to, sometimes Alana and I will know who that person is at that other big company or someone over there. So that's another avenue that you can always kind of think about how to get to the right person. But also, to another point to consider is, many times we are, as an organization, just like Alana and others, are looking at new indications for some of our therapies that we might be exploring. Some of the best ways are when physicians do case reports and they publish that they've been using an existing drug in other areas that might have a new unmet need. So I would encourage you and whoever your medical board is to raise the awareness of those possible new indications, because that gets on our radar too, that we may not already have something identified. So that's another way from a rare disease perspective to consider.
Great point, Tricia.
Yeah, thank you. So our next question is from Lisa Peretti, and she asks, what makes a funding application more likely to succeed in being approved?
Mm.
Oh, the $64 million question, Lisa. Yeah, Tricia, I don't know if you want to start on this one.
I'll start. I would say one of the things that's the most reasonable for us in our roles is that if it's I call it digestible and reasonable. So for example, if an organization asks us for the first time they've ever worked with us for $1 million, that's probably going to be a hard, I'm not sure we could ever do that. Now, if you came to us and said, we have this really unique initiative that we would like to explore for under 50,000. And this, we'd like to partner and do X, Y, and Z, or 10,000. That might be something that there's a little bit more appetite that's digestible. And if you say, let's do A, then B, then C, that's something that organizations like Pharma say, okay, it's not this big ticket dollar item project that's going to take 3 years for us to buy into or better support. So I think if it's reasonable, and I know everyone has a different level of reasonableness, but I think that, do a gut check with your advocacy people and say, if I submit a request for 150,000, is that going to be just like a hard no real quick? And that's something that we can give you a gut check as to what's reasonable. Many times Alana and I will say, wow, this organization asked for this amount to do this type of awareness month. And if it's triple in another disease area, that's going to be a red flag for our compliance folks. So those gut checks are really important for us to think about what's within the ballpark of reasonableness that we support and what's definitely not going to go farther. Alana, I'm sure you have some additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it all, right? And Lisa, I'd love to tell you this is the formula, but there isn't a formula. Our budgets year over year look different. Our priorities look different year over year. And so it's hard to say, if you submit this type of proposal, you're good to go, right? As I mentioned, Tricia and I can certainly tell our compliance folks that we are supportive of providing funding for a certain initiative, but they ultimately get to say yay or nay, because we need to make sure that it stays within, the right framework and an ethical framework. And there's a lot of variables and dependencies, but that's also why I always go back to a really strong letter of request that is also very clear about who you are as an organization, why you're seeking the ask that you're seeking, and how you plan to use it. I think the fewer questions along the way from compliance, the further and smoother the conversations can go internally.
That's really helpful. And I think that segues nicely into Mark's question. Are there any types of funding requests that industry will not necessarily fund?
Well, I mean, if you want to send me on a cruise, probably cannot sign off on that. It's a good question, but I think it's a really important one. So there are different types of funding from industry. So I can tell you from a patient advocacy perspective, I can't provide support for any medical education type of efforts. It's non-compliant for me to do that. There's also what's known as charitable contributions, which is just a true donation without any type of benefits that are offered to the sponsor. It's really a donation, and yours to do with it as you've said you'll do with it. Um, I also, from a patient advocacy perspective, can't provide support for patient registries, or anything that may be involving discussions around treatment guidelines. Now, just because I can't support that doesn't mean that support from potentially my medical affairs colleagues or from clinical might not be possible. And again, it's about who your contact is at the organization. So if you come to me and Trisha and say, really interested and really want to find the right way to do this type of program, even if we're not the right people, we may be able to at least provide some guidance on who could fund that.
Yeah, good points.
Yeah.
Alana, I might also add some of the other areas that we see that we get occasionally, but not as often as we did in the past, is events that are golf outings to raise to fundraisers. That tends to be an area where the intention is great to raise money for this disease area, but many times us in the pharma industry can't support necessarily golf fundraisers. And I think it's the word golf associated with it. Sometimes wine events that might be a wine fundraiser, that tends to be a little bit more, just we get a lot more questions. And at the end of the day, you might maybe refocus efforts on another initiative. Those are two areas that I also see, but also to Alana's point, it may not be a hard no for some registries. It just might be we need to connect you with another department within our larger organization who handles that effectively from a compliance perspective.
That's really helpful. So another question from Janice, what are some projects or initiatives that have been funded by your groups in the past?
So many.
Yeah.
I mean, happy to use examples of from some of the groups that are members of CSD. IPPF just this past weekend had their annual patient conference. It was done virtually again, and they did a fantastic job. And Regeneron and Sanofi Genzyme were really proud to be able to support their efforts in bringing the community together for a couple of days of education and networking. So patient conferences in general, I think is, one bucket of area, but certainly not the only one. I know we're short on time. So Trisha, I don't know if you also want to give an example.
Awareness months, awareness educational brochures are always helpful that most companies do have an interest to help support. Anything that may raise awareness and understanding of the disease in the community for undiagnosed or even diagnosed patients of these diseases are things that we tend to look favorably for support as well.
That's great. And I just want to bring up something that we had talked about in the past, but it's so important. We're asking you a lot of questions about funding, but it's so important to know what your priorities are as well as companies and find that common ground in that overlap of how we can do these projects together and collaborate so that the patients ultimately win in the end, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's super important too. One last question from Kevin. How are long-term multi-year initiatives viewed? Is it better to split into single year portions?
What a good question, Kevin. Wow, these guys are coming up with some toughies. Not toughies, but I think from my perspective, we are not able to commit to a multi-year program. And that's because our budgets have to sort of recur every new calendar year for us. And so compliantly, legal, says you can't commit funds that you don't already have to a particular program. And so I think, we really like to see opportunities for phased approaches. And I think there's nothing wrong with a program or an initiative that is multi-year. But I think we do much better when the conversation is this is going to be a multi-year program. Here's what we want to get done this year, and here's what we're seeking support for and why. And then, you have the same conversation around year 2, 3, 4, and however further it goes.
Yeah, I can't add anything else. The only thing I might compliment that we didn't talk about from a metrics perspective is tell us what's going on so that we can relay that back. So if it's a multi-year program, Kevin, and you're doing all these great things in year 1, make sure and share them with the partners or even future partners so that it helps us address the need in our budget to continue that support the 2nd and 3rd year.
Thank you. I had not been looking in the chat box for questions. Can we do one last question? I know we started late.
Let's do it.
Is that okay? Okay, this is from Jody. She asked, what metrics or data points are most valuable to have from patient organization? What's an average award size or length of time? So 2 questions for you.
Yeah, I think the second question is probably hard to answer as far as award size and length of time. It really depends on the group, what the program or initiative is, right? If it's a patient conference, it's going to happen over a couple of days, and that's okay. If it's an educational series for the entire year, that looks a little different. And the metrics will depend on the type of program. For us, it's not just about the quantitative metrics, although it's always really great to know how many people attended a particular webinar or a patient conference, or how many people downloaded, this disease information. But think also about those qualitative metrics. Are you driving a change in behavior in any way? Are you driving a change in the conversation that's happening within the community around a particular disease or decision making? So I encourage you to really think about what are the things that you can measure and how, through survey mechanisms. This is how it looked like when people answered the questions before we started this initiative. We went back to them 6 months later. Look at the greater, increase in knowledge and engagement. I mean, those are all really important metrics for us to have.
Mhm.
I think I might also compliment Alana's comment in the sense that also include in your requests or your data points how long it took you to get the activity ready to go. Because many times we see requests for a program that's happening June 30th of next year. And sometimes our colleagues are like, well, we've got till June 1st to make a decision. And when reality is you guys need to know earlier if we're coming on board to support it so that you could do all the work to have a successful program on June 30th. So make sure as you include your metrics or your request to say, I need 3 months to prepare all the materials for this event to be successful on June 30th.
That's great. Thank you both so much. We just appreciate you and your hearts for patients and your ease of engagement. You're just so wonderful to work with. And just want to thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to educate us and help the collaboration between our groups. And we just really appreciate your support of the coalition as well. So thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you very much for having us. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
Yeah.
Okay. Until next time, everyone. Bye-bye.